Right, we are dealing with academic writing skills today. And once we're done with the presentation, you will see that I've covered content that you wouldn't have thought about. So I hope you find this interesting and that you also enjoy the session as much as I do. This is one of my favorites every year. Right now, what is academic writing? I will guide you through the fact that it should be clear. That is what your project, your proposal. I assume that the majority of you are busy with your proposals. If you pass the proposal phase, you are busy with your chapters of your master's dissertation or your thesis. Right. Academic writing should be clear. It should be concise, well structured, focused, and all of those should be backed up by evidence. I'm going to explain to you about the evidence in a while. So remember this slide and this illustration. So I'm just going to repeat quickly. Your academic document or manuscript should be clear, the message that you are conveying. It should be concise. It must be focused and well structured. And finally, it should be backed up by evidence. Right, now the characteristics I'm going to explain or to discuss to you or with you what I've just dealt with in the previous slide. What I mean by planned and focused. It should answer all the questions and should also demonstrate your knowledge and skills of your research topic. Structured, it must be in a logical order. The reader must be able to understand the message that you are trying to convey and must also understand the logic flow of the content that you are presenting. Evidence, it means that we must be able, as the reader and the audience, to understand what you are trying to convey. Also show that you have the necessary knowledge of your subject field or subject area. It must consist of evidence that support your opinions and arguments, and it must be referenced accurately. Now, something that we as supervisors, and I also know that students struggle with that, is the referencing. All right, I'm going to deal or handle that with you in a while, but the referencing is something that we find very often as challenging, but I'll give you guidance on that and assist you to make your life so much easier. Also, formal in tone and style. It must use the appropriate language and tenses. Also, it must be clear, concise, and balanced. Now I'm going to share with you something from my own experience. Afrikaans is my first language or my home mother tongue. So English is also challenging for me from time to time, especially when I'm trying to convey a message. When I compile an email, I type it and then I read through it several times before I press the send button, just to make sure that the message I'm trying to convey is of such a standard and nature that it conveys the message, as well as that it's formal, especially in the business environment or our working environment. Also, when you are sending emails to your supervisor, it's important that it should be well planned, structured, and formal in your tone and style. So for the majority of us, English is not our first language. So this is really something that we need to invest in. So I understand people or the audience, students, if you struggle with that, but I'll guide you with tools and tips on how to assist you. Now, academic writing is a question of form rather than function. By developing sound and logical arguments, check your grammar. You must cite your references correctly and your sources by sticking to a required format, and you must or don't end up with a different argument. Now, very important, especially on a PhD or doctoral level, is that you must present arguments. You must defend the arguments. You either support it or you reject the arguments that you don't agree with what the author said, and that your message and your argument must be clearer, more rigorous, and easier to understand. Now, what is academic and what is it not? It must be formal and unbiased. Remember that you need to present the information from literature when you are doing the literature section. It must be presented formal and unbiased. It must be clear and precise, focused and well structured, well sourced or referenced, and correct and consistent. I hope you can see how this column links to what I've said previously. And then what is it not? It's not personal, not long-winded. You are not going to, when you want to go to Pretoria or from Pretoria to Johannesburg, take the route via Cape Town. You must take the shortest route, convey your message and the information in the shortest possible way, that it's clear and concise. You must not include emotive and grandiose language, meaning that present the content as accurately as possible. Don't include additional words or text that elaborate on what you are saying. Cut to the chase, present the message, and that must be as short and precise and concise as possible. Right, now if we are going to look at the different styles, the structures, words and terms, I want to start off by the following. That it's much more difficult to write something that is easy to read than to write something that is difficult to read. I want to come back to the email example. Now, I think that you will agree with me that if you write an email or a WhatsApp message to your friend or family members, you use a different style and tone. But when you need to type something or send something to your supervisor, it needs to be in a different tone and style. So very important to distinguish between a professional way of typing and writing the information and an informal way. So it's very easy to read something that is, or it's difficult to write something that is, or it's difficult to read, something that is written than to write something that is easy to read. Okay, with that in mind, I'm going to start with the styles and sentences. I'm just going back to the previous slide, that the first part of the heading is style. That's what I'm going to deal with now. And then structure, words and terms just after that. Now the styles and sentences. Your writing style must be formal and in an academic tone. I've mentioned that. You will see throughout the presentation that it feels like a repetition of certain terminology and information, but this is just how it is with academic writing. It is to assist you. Now, for example, if you write an informal message to somebody, you will use words like don't and can't and isn't. But in formal writing, you write it out in words. It's do not, cannot, is not. So that is very important. Also, avoid strong adjectives. For example, huge, excellent, major. There's a variety of words like that. Don't say, for example, it's a huge improvement. Just say that it is a remarkable or it's an improvement. That says enough already. So sometimes students want to impress their supervisors by including a lot of strong adjectives. Please, people, stay clear from that. It really doesn't impress us at all. It takes away from the message that you are trying to convey to us as well as your audience. Now, before I continue, who will be your audience? That includes other researchers and scholars that's going to read your documents, your articles, your dissertation, your thesis at the end of the day. It's also your supervisor, it is other colleagues, and it might be that you are having an academic reader who is going to read through your documents as well, a critical reader. Right, then also make a statement or omit the statement. Be very specific. Do not soften it with words like actually and really. I very often have to delete words like this, and when I provide feedback to my students, I request them to remove words like that. So please, people, it really don't impress the supervisors at all. And I'm saying again, it removes the focus point of your arguments and your statements. Then words like however, nevertheless, although add a lot of value to your text. So that you can bear in mind, and also avoid, also rather use in addition and use furthermore or moreover. I hope that you can see that furthermore, for example, and moreover is more formal than also and in addition. Then avoid sweeping statements. I've got an example there for you. Implementation of XYZ strategy in the middle management can transform retail banking. Now, what is a sweeping statement? It's a phrase of a sentence that makes a generalization. Don't think that you are in that specific field, that everybody knows it. When you are working, for example, and you are busy with your studies, don't think that the audience or the readers know exactly what is going on in your environment. Be specific, don't generalize at all. I'm continuing from where I stopped with the previous slide. Don't be too rigid or strict. What we mean by that is don't be too dogmatic. Also, with that, we mean that it must be easy to read it. We must be able to understand what you are trying to say. Don't put yourself in a specific box. Now, I can't overemphasize the following, that there's a difference between a master's and a doctoral study. In a doctoral study, you need to include a lot of evidence as well as arguments where you support or differ from the argument, and you must back it up by literature or by experience. So very important is that in a master study, you can't always include your own opinion. You can only include that after you've conducted your data analysis. But in the literature review and all of those, you can add your own voice, but don't add your own opinion. There's a difference between the two. Avoid overuse of a term. What happens is that when you reference authors, say Van Antwerpen said, now you say Dube said, Naidu said. You can see that with through my example, I use the word said with every reference that I cited. Rather say Van Antwerpen mentioned, Naidu stressed, Dube said. So differ it between the different words there. Very important is that, for example, I've reviewed a document or a submission of one of my students, and in one paragraph that student used the word said or stressed. It was stressed in this example about 8 times. It's overuse of a certain term. Now here, be careful of the repetition or the duplication of a specific point. If you mentioned it, you mentioned it already. Don't present it over and over again to fill up space. Then, very important is that sentences should not be too long. What I do as a supervisor, if I see that sentences are a bit too long, I highlight the sentence and then I look at the bottom of the screen, how many words has been in that specific sentence. So if I see that it's more than 45 words is already a bit too long, then I request my students to break it into 2 sentences. If the sentence is too long, the meaning gets lost, completely lost. So always hear in your in the back of your head that Professor Van Antwerpen said when she gave this presentation, do not include long sentences. I can't overemphasize this enough. Do not ramble. One idea or piece of information per sentence. Now, very important is also that paragraphs shouldn't be too short. What I teach my students is that it must not be less than 2 sentences. It must be more than 2 sentences. If it is less than 2 sentences, see if you can add that to a previous paragraph or break a previous paragraph. If it's more than one topic in a paragraph, break it down to 2 paragraphs. I hope that you catch my drift. It's very important. Always remember that a paragraph cannot consist of 1 sentence. What I also find is that students write 1 sentence in a paragraph and then it consists of 60 to 70 words. That is not acceptable at all. Then also styles and sentences. I will do the multiple authors with you on a next slide as well. If you have multiple authors, cite the names of the first time when you present them. So you heard the Latin words et al. Now, the first instance where you present authors that consist, a reference that consists of 3 or more authors, you need to type it in full or present it in full. And then from the second time you reference the same authors or document, you need to include the first author and then replace the rest of the authors with the words et al. Now you can see that I presented it in italic font. Look at the guidelines from your different department or school where you are busy or that you are registered in. What is their guides, how they want you to present it. But if you use, for example, the italic font, use that throughout your document. Don't alternate between italics and then normal font. So that is very important. Don't ever start a sentence with a number. No numeric numbers. Look at the example there. It should be in words. That is when you present that in a sentence. So a sentence may never start with a numeric number. Shorter sentences, as I've mentioned earlier, makes your work easier to understand. It's easier for the reader, for us as your supervisors, to understand the message that you would like to convey to us to understand. Then remove clutter words. They do not add any value to your work, not at all. So if there's clutter words, rather remove that from your work. Then, very important, number subheadings, for example, 2.2.1 and 2 and 3. I will do that on one of the other slides as well. I'll explain to you about the numbering. Then, how should you construct a paragraph? Now, what I request my students to do, this is up to you if you would like to use that or my method. I ask them to read through their different sources. And then from that point and onwards, they want to construct a paragraph. Say, for example, as part of a main topic. Then I ask them to use a piece of paper next to their computer to take the different articles to read on that specific point and to write down what they understand. In that way, they avoid the temptation of conducting plagiarism. So they must then, in their own words, write down with pen and paper. Write down what they understand, and when they construct that and type it in their manuscript, make sure that you start or they start with a lead sentence. That indicates to the reader exactly what the paragraph will be about. So that introduces the reader to what they can expect in the paragraph. Also then provide an argument using the following pattern: assertion, evidence and agreement, or affirmation and discussion. So you can come back to this and just make sure that that is more or less how your argument and the pattern is constructed. Then mention contradictory beliefs and counter arguments. So you present the arguments and then you must say, do you counter the arguments? Is it contradictory? Say, for example, you present definitions. Van Antwerpen defined a laptop as this. Ndube defined a laptop as that. And then you will use the following definition that you can, for example, construct out of all the other definitions. All right. So just make sure that you also say that you support the argument or that you have another belief of this. If everything is positive, examiners do not find it credible, especially on a P or PhD or doctoral level. We need to see that you are able to understand the literature, that you are able to add your own voice, and that you are able to dissect what you are writing, and also to make sure that you understand and that you can add another argument, either that contradicts the previous arguments, or you support that. And you must motivate. Remember, motivation is very important as well as justification. Now I've got there for you, just at the bottom of this slide. I don't know what the prescriptions of your departments are, but we basically make use of Arial font or Times New Roman. They are regarded as formal font styles. So just remember that as well. Then styles and sentences. I'm continuing here. Say, for example, you need to change something. You have a sentence, and then when you read it again, you discover, I want this part to present it before the argument or in another spot. Now, what I explained to you here is to use copy and not cut. The reason why I say so, and I learned this the hard way, is that, remember, you can click on the undo part. But as soon as you click on undo, it's going to undo whatever you did, and then you might lose what you originally want to do. I'm going to see if I can. No, it doesn't work. I'll explain to you. Okay. If you see, I hope you can see where my cursor is. I want to use the words decide on deleting this section here. I want to put it in just after the word then. I know it's not going to make sense at all. So what I do is I highlight this, and instead of using cut to put it there, I use copy. So then I include it here and I read this. As soon as I decide, okay, this is acceptable, that is what I want it to be or how it should be, then I go back and I delete this section. I hope it makes sense. I'm trying to explain it to the best of my ability to you here. So very important, and that is a lesson that I learned and I want to share with you. So use copy and not cut. So you copy this section to this point, read it several times, and if you are happy with it, then you can go and delete it there. If you're not happy, you can just remove this by undo, and this section decide on remains where it is. Otherwise, it might leave a gap, and then if you decide that you still want to use it, it might be gone. Then, still busy with styles and sentences. Reread a whole section where you added something. Make sure that the golden thread is intact. I'll do with you the golden thread a little bit later on in this presentation. Also, the new content that you included. Does it still fit the context of that paragraph? Answer this question. Make sure that it's not a duplication. You might need to rephrase text to make it flow better. Then, I mentioned earlier, we are now going to look at the paragraph section as well as the structure. Avoid long sections of text. I've said that earlier in the presentation. Please subdivide it. Then, it's easier to use hierarchical subheaders. Now, what I teach my students is that it's acceptable to use 4 levels, like 3.5.2.2. I hope you can see that the final full stop here where my cursor is in red. I'll also do this with you a little bit later on. It's very important that the last number must not have a full stop. So it will be 3.5.2.2, no full stop after that. I know that when you number automatically, it includes a full stop. You must go to the settings and undo the full stop. It mustn't be included. Then also 4th level subheaders need not be in a table of contents. Again, it's up to you. Remember that if you include 4 or 5 levels of subheaders, your table of contents become too cluttered. So again, it's up to the styles of your department. Just go and read through that as well. I also find that students don't read the study guide. They don't read the study guide, and then when we have to comment on that, they are not very happy. So make sure that you read your study guide, read what is acceptable for your department or your school or the college where you are enrolled in. Also, the first level of subheaders, normally in, if you look at that slide, I'll come back to the previous one. The main heading is in bold and capital letters. The subheading is in bold and lowercase with an initial capital letter at the beginning. I hope that you can see that the 2nd, 3rd and 4th level does not have a full stop at the end, but the 1st level must have a full stop. And then the 3rd level must be in bold and italics, and then the next one, the 4th level is in bold, not in bold, sorry, in italics and normal text. That is what I've explained to you here. Also, it's acceptable to have a comma before the final and. What I mean by that is that you can, for example, say that the color of my curtains are red, comma, blue, comma, and green. So the comma before the word and is acceptable. Years ago, it wasn't, but the styles changed over the years. It is now acceptable. If you send your document for language editing, that will be one of the things that the language editor will have a look at. Right. You can also use semicolons to subdivide the points, and bullets are very useful. Sometimes it's very difficult to read through a paragraph if you present different shorter sections. It's very well accepted to make use of bullets. Then very important is do not use very lengthy headings. Rather see if you can shorten that. It makes it easier to read, especially in your table of contents. If you have long headings, it doesn't present that good and professionally as well. I've also said to you here in the blue bubble, only the main heading with a single paragraph number ends with a full stop. There is the main heading. You are more than welcome. As Tony said to you, we are going to provide you with this presentation. Use this as a study guide or your academic writing Bible in initial or in inverted commas. All right, this can really provide you with a lot of valuable information. Myself go back to this presentation from time to time. Right, then again, I can't overemphasize the fact that what you say, and in this case we look at tables figures, and headers of documents must be concise and to the point. It must be consistent in style. Choose word order of a header to emphasize the meaning. Very important is the following, and my students very often forget the following. You need to introduce an illustration, a graph, a picture, a table in the paragraph prior to presenting the table. So you must say table 5.1 below ABC and whatever. Then the table must have a caption which say, or a header which say it's table 5.1 and what you will present in there. Also the same with figures. The reason why it is 5.1 means that it is in chapter 5. Figure 2.1 will be in chapter 2. Now, when you are busy with your proposal, you don't have chapters yet, so you stick to table 1, 2, and 3 or figure 1, 2, and 3. Then the style that you use, make sure that you use the same style throughout. Please do not make use of different styles. It then looks like a fruit salad at the end of the day. Tables and figures. Very important is the position of the labels. A table heading should be presented above the table, whereas figure labels must be presented below the figure. This is not something that I made up. This is a general rule. Please apply that throughout your document. Write a section, that is the third bullet, about the table or figure. So before you present it, introduce it by telling the reader what they can expect in the table or the figure. I always say that sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words. Instead of writing a lengthy paragraph, some of those content present very well in a table or a figure. So I then prefer that. It's just something to alternate between text and tables and pictures. It just brings a little bit of change between text and then you present a table and you continue. What I always ask my students to do is to present a table where they, for example, summarize different studies that they read, especially in the proposal. I request them with a literature review to include a table there where they, for example, have in the one column the date of publication, the authors, and then in a third column the title of the article, and then in the fourth column what the conclusion was for that specific article. With one glance, the examiner and your supervisor can clearly see that you consulted all the necessary literature for that specific topic and that you can summarize that in a table. Instead of doing that in a paragraph, this is just more professional to me. When I write articles for journals, that's what I also do for the reviewers to see and also for the readers and the other scholars in the scholarly domain to see exactly which articles I have consulted and why. Tables are used for summarizing, presenting data, use left alignment and single spacing in the cells. If your guidelines say that you must use, say for example, for your proposal 1.5 line spacing or 1.15, or that we mainly use 1.5, then I prefer in the tables to use single line spacing, otherwise it takes up a lot of pages. So for that instance, my students make use of single line spacing. I've got an example for you here. In the paragraph just above the table, I said table 1.1 below presents information about the population of South Africa. Can you see that the label of the table, the heading, it's table 1.1 and it says population because I mentioned here population. I don't type the heading as population of South Africa. Population is fine because here you included South Africa. In this case, I compiled this table myself, so the source will be own compilation. I just want you to look at the table. This is my own preference. Some people like to put all this information centered. What I find is that the full stops are not always aligned. It looks as if it is sort of, I don't know. I don't have words to describe it, but it's not aligned, and for me, it's not professional. So what I do is in the first column, I have all the content here. You can see that it's a left aligned, and then here I choose right alignment. But this is just my own preference. It's up to you what you prefer. Now, another example of a figure. Again, above the figure, I said depicts or below illustrate the data about the gender groups in the Department of Labour. Now, in this case, the source, it's Stat South Africa. But what is missing from this slide? Can you see that I didn't include the figure caption? So this will be figure 1.1, as I mentioned here. And what would we label this? Gender. Or you can say gender, colon, Department of Labour. Now, graphs in data analysis chapter, that's when you are past your proposal phase. When you collect data yourself, this is especially in quantitative studies, you don't include the source because remember the source will be from your data that you collected. So then you don't have a source, you will only have the figure caption. Then I've got for you another example. Introduce a figure. I've said here. Again, this is just a repetition of what I said in the previous table. In this case, I included Saunders Research Onion. There is the figure label or caption at the bottom, 3.5. You can see that it is coinciding with what I've mentioned in a paragraph above. There's the title and then the source in brackets behind that, or if your prescription says that you must have the name of the figure and then in the next line source colon Saunders et al, then it will not start with a bracket. You present Saunders et al and then the date will be between brackets. Then after presenting the figure, you need to explain what you presented here. You don't have to repeat everything, but just explain briefly what this figure is about. Don't just present the figure and then stop, because the reader and your supervisor do not know what is going on. And remember, we don't have time to go and decipher exactly what goes on in that illustration. Then, consistency in styles of bullets. If you use the round bullet, please use that throughout your document. Don't in chapter 1 use this bullet and then in chapter 2 another bullets, or in one chapter different types of bullets. I also advise my students to use bullets that use a black font. Don't go and use fancy bullets, because immediately it affects your line spacing and it's not that professional at all. So stick to formal bullets, the ones that are presented in the default of the bullet styles. Consistency with the first person. Now, years ago, we did not use first person. We always used third person. But nowadays, especially in qualitative studies, it is acceptable that you use the first person. We, if it's multiple researchers, or I, if you are the only researcher. That is acceptable. If you read articles, current articles, you will see that that is what they've done, or they use the first person. Now, students, that is perfectly acceptable, especially in qualitative research studies. Don't be influenced by a publication that you are currently reading with different styles. Remember that when we as researchers submit an article to a specific journal, that journal provides us with author guidelines. That means that that is guidelines that we need to follow. Now, if you consult different articles from different journals, you will notice that they've got different styles. Don't get confused between the different styles. Use the style that you use for your study. Again, this is where my paper and pen example comes in very handy. My students are then forced to put their content in such a way that they are not confused and between or influenced by the different publications that they read. It is important to understand the workplace of your participant. So make sure that you include informal styles as well. Don't be influenced by the publications that you are reading. I've overemphasized this now. Rather say it is important to understand the participant's workplace. Can you see the difference between the two sentences? Make use of the second part where I've fixed it for you so that it is formal, and fix or solve the issue of going back to an informal style. Now, spelling and terms. The default of your software program will be in the US dictionary mode. Now, in South Africa, we don't use that. We make use of the UK or the South African dictionary. So set that, your default, at the beginning of your document and make sure that that is what you use. Unfortunately, you'll have to do that for all your documents. So just change the default so that you are using the UK or the RSA dictionary. When you publish an article after you completed your study, and it's for journals where they want the Americanized version, then you can just change the dictionary back to American, and that will then change all the S's to Z's. Also, when you type, for example, the word color, or there's other examples as well, flavor, they omit in America or the US, they omit the U, but in the UK, the British or the South African dictionary, we include that as well. So if you get a comment from your supervisor that you need to change that, please make sure that that is, and this is how you mitigate this issue. All right. Then also, sometimes we have the word online. It's one word, online. Or online, it's got another meaning, or online is another meaning. So just make sure that you use that consistently and stick to the correct word and the correct meaning. Avoid Americanisms. I've explained this to you. Don't say, for example, this is a style, an example, XYZ comprises of A and B. Rather say XYZ consists of A and B, or XYZ comprised of A and B. So you can come back to this example. It will really help you a great deal. Now the tenses, sometimes our worst enemy, because we don't always know exactly what tense. And if it's not our first language, I find it very difficult, and I'm going to be honest with you. That is one of the most challenging parts for me, is the tenses. Now I've got an example for you here. Scott in 2019 points out that PQR is characterized by ABC, and that came from Scott in 2019. Tambo in 2021 claims that. So just have a look at when it's present tense. However, events that occurred previously and are reported on in literature should be in the past tense. A study was conducted in China by Chen and Shi. Mkhize found that. Remember, the study has already been conducted, so that must be in the past tense. Then, use the past tense when you discuss your own research. Research of or results of the experiment demonstrated that findings of the survey or questionnaire were mainly positive. You can see that I'm using the past tense there. Then, be consistent in tenses in the same section. This slip happens very easily when you rewrite your proposal as chapter 1. Now, when you pass your proposal module, you will find that you are going to convert it into a chapter 1. But remember, when you do your proposal, you need to convince and to convey the message to your readers and the examiners what you are still going to do. You are going to do research on A, B, and C. You are going to use this questionnaire. You are going to do data collection. But in chapter 1, you are going to use past tense because you are going to rewrite it. It's very difficult. What I sometimes do with my students, they do chapter 1. Then we park it. I don't sign off on chapter 1. They continue with chapter 2, 3, 4, and 5. And once they completed the study, they go back to chapter 1 and update it with what they've done. Because remember, if you say in chapter 1 what you are going to do, okay, and then halfway in your study, you decided that no, you are going to change the data collection method, or you realized that you are going to include, for example, another objective after you've done your data collection. You realized that your statistician or your qualitative analyst find that there is room for another objective or a research question. That can then be updated as well. I hope you still keep up and that you are not tired by now. I know it's a lot of information, but you will have to work through this on your own as well. I'm going to give you a bit of a comfort break at about 10 o'clock because I'm having load shedding at 10 o'clock so that we can just see that I run over smoothly to another device. So I'm going to do this slide more or less, and then we can have a 5-minute comfort break if that is okay with you and the workshop organizer. All right. Okay, then I agree, you agree, he, she agrees, they agree. The participant is only one, agrees. Participants more than one, agree. My dog obeys, it's one dog. My dogs, more than one, obey. My dog is obedient and my dogs are obedient. Then Scott et al. It means that there is more than three or more authors hold the view that, and you continue. Evidence has been found. You don't say evidence have been found. So it's evidence has. Many of these attributions or attributes are common. M-learning and e-learning are considered in section 3.2. This is just an example for you because we have two different constructs and themes here. M-learning is one and e-learning is another one. So it adds up to 2. They are. The chapter, it's one chapter, aims to explain. Data can be viewed as singular or plural. So data can be is contradictory or data are contradictory. All right, so it's one of the 2. I just want to see. Okay, I'm going to do this slide as well. Then it's almost 10 o'clock. Hyphens. Now this can be a bit challenging and also the rules change quite a lot. Your language editor will help you there as well, and your supervisor as well. All right, just remember that supervisors, they are not actually there to change your spelling and your tenses. We do that, but that is not our main priority. Our main priority is to make sure that the information that you convey and the meaning is clear, that there is a logic flow, and also that your content is of such a nature that we can follow, that the golden thread is there. Now, if you look at the first example, use together as an adjective, use a hyphen, for example, in a problem-solving situation. You can see that there is a hyphen because we use words as adjectives. And then I need to call on my decision-making skills. Then, when 2 words together form a noun, a hyphen is not required. Then, for example, problem solving is used as a noun, decision-making as a noun, and then it is time for some decision-making. A hyphen is not required. Then subsections, subdivide, rephrase, etc. The current practice is that we write it without a hyphen. For example, not subsections, subdivide, and rephrase. All right. Okay, now we are going to look at chapter introductions and conclusions. Very important that you start each chapter or section with an introduction. Now, for the proposal module, this is not going to be that important, but for the different sections, that is important that you include an introduction. But when you are busy with your dissertation or your thesis, remember that every chapter or section must start with an introduction, especially if you are introducing a new concept or context. Right. Overviews of what is in each chapter or section. So in your introduction, you say what happened in the previous chapter. Now, this is what we refer to as the golden thread. Also, in the introduction, explains the role of the chapter, how it relates to previous chapter and the next. Right. Then, it's nice to have a theme diagram of what each chapter will be covering. Now, there's various ways of doing it. The first one is to, for example, create an organigram, or you can use different shapes. You can also use Visio to do that as well. That is another software program from the Office suite, but it's not always included. So I prefer to do it manually myself, but all my students must include a mind map or an overview of the section, a theme diagram. On the next page, I'll just show you in a while what I mean by that. I've got a lot of examples, but this differs from student to student, also from the study. I'm just going to go down one more. I removed that, sorry. I removed that. I will send you an example when I submit all of these to the organizer, just an example for you. All right, so as I said, it's a theme diagram. So after the introduction or at the beginning of each chapter, a page before you present a specific chapter, my students must include there a different a theme diagram so that the reader and the examiner knows exactly what they can expect in that specific chapter. Then also mention subsections. Say in section 3.1, X, Y, and Z will happen in section 3.2. Now remember that this is in your introduction. So that just explain to the reader what they can expect. It can also be done concisely with parentheses, X, Y, and Z overviewed, Y, K, X are listed. So that is just different ways of referring to that as well. Now that should happen with your chapter or section conclusion. So you just summarize what happened in this chapter, what you dealt with, because that makes sure that you have the golden thread throughout your chapter. Right. It should include a summary of what was covered, as well as important interpretations and conclusions. In a conclusion, you do not include new references. So that is only a conclusion of the chapter, a summary of the chapter. Explain the role of the chapter, how it relates to upcoming chapters. What I mean by that is, say for example, you completed the literature chapter. Then you say in your conclusion, this is what you dealt with, and then chapter 3 will address the research methodology. Now for a doctoral study, there might be sometimes 2 or 3 literature chapters. So just make sure that you link them together, explain to the reader what they can expect in the following chapter. Then before a conclusion, this is especially for articles as well, a discussion should be included, and in your dissertation and thesis, also just make sure that if your supervisor wants a discussion, that is basically actually included in your chapters. So that is included there, but the discussion can be before or in your data analysis chapter. You sometimes present the analysis or your findings or the results, and then the findings will form part of a discussion. Please consult with your supervisor on this. We do not introduce new points, new references, new concepts in the conclusion of a chapter, not at all. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and I promised, I'm going to look at the referencing and citations. For certain disciplines like psychology and human resources, it depends on the discipline. They make use of an APA referencing styles. In other disciplines, make use of Harvard referencing styles. So make sure that you have the guidelines. If you go to the library, I don't know if you had the library section already or presentation already, but there is a section where we refer to the LIP guides. Now the LIP guides also include, as per your college, what the referencing styles will be. Also look at that. It's a very handy tool to help you with the referencing. If I write for journals, they sometimes have different referencing styles like Chicago or APA or Harvard. Then what I do is that I open a reference guide for myself so that I can see how it should be done. And then if, for example, the article is rejected and I have to submit it to another journal, what I then do is that I have to update the referencing accordingly. So that is quite a time-consuming exercise. If you make use of Mendeley or EndNote, make sure that the settings of your referencing methods are correct, because otherwise it's really challenging to change it back again. So just make sure the referencing style, and also if you make use of automatic referencing, that what you put in is correct. Right, now let's look at the first one. In the field study by Batter and whatever, it was found that the Lackaby birds. Now, just the date is in parentheses because Becker and Smith forms part of the sentence. Then you don't use the ampersand. This is something that I struggle with my students, is to grasp this. Very often what we do is we take a reference and we copy it to other instances as well. Please don't do that. That can create a lot of additional effort for you. Authors and dates in parentheses. The Lackaby bird can be or can fly backwards in cold conditions. Now the reference appears at the back or at the end of the sentence. So there it is, both between parentheses. This is the APA style. This is the Harvard style. Also, don't mix the two. Stick to the same one throughout your document. Right. So remember that this is part of the sentence. Then you type the word and in full. This is between parentheses at the back of end of a sentence. And then you use the ampersand as well. Then after the last author, we have a comma and then the date. If you have a direct quote, you have to put in a colon and the page number. So remember, page numbers should be included for direct quotes. What I do with my students, and that is just my personal preference, I request them to put in page numbers even though it's not a direct quote. They can then afterwards delete the page numbers, because as soon as articles must be written, then those articles sometimes require page numbers with all the references. So instead of then going back to everything, they have it. My students must rather then delete the page numbers than not to have it. I hope it makes sense. Then the reference is part of a sentence and must have a comma between the full stop. There is, for example, two examples, Lynn, 2015 and Lynn 2015. Again, it depends on the referencing style of your college and your department, as well as your discipline. Referencing and citations for a PhD, cite only original sources. Now, I want you to listen carefully to the following. If you make use of seminal work, an example is Maslow's hierarchy, okay? That has been developed, say, for example, in 1964. Sorry. Then Maslow's hierarchy has been cited from 1964 up to 2020. Don't use a current source. If it is seminal work, you must include it where it has been originally presented. Okay, that's like, for example, Alderfer's theory. There is different theories that has been developed over the years. It hasn't changed. You must use the original reference. So just make sure of that. For master's degree, you can use secondary referencing. For example, Hollard is a chapter in the work published by Klein. So then you can use secondary referencing as well. When citing a source after its previous citation, you don't have to include a date. For example, it has been shown that the food Firm and Fit causes a mean weight increase of 15% female pigs and 10% in males. The authors here is Neverend and Nguni. You can see that that is placed at the end of the sentence, and it was published in 2019. Then, furthermore, Neverend and Nguni, you can see that in the example here, we use the ampersand, and then in the text, in the sentence, you write it out in words. So don't just copy this, because that is not correct, and you don't have to include the year of publication, because it's exactly the next sentence. Okay, oopsie daisy. Okay, avoid multiple consecutive references to the same source. In a paragraph, don't use never end and Nguni throughout the paragraph. Incorporate other sources and references as well. Don't overuse the same reference. Referencing and citations, we continue with this. Include the page number when citing a direct quote. I've mentioned this to you as well. You can look at the example there. It's 2019, published by Frey, and it's on page 12. You can see that this is a direct quote. It's between inverted commas. It should be between inverted commas. Then you can use the ampersand when the full citation is in parentheses, like Nguni and Naidu and Nguni. But when the name flows in the sentence, it is not part of a direct quotation. You include that as and. I've mentioned that on the previous slide as well. Then citation styles can be used at the start of a sentence. For example, Naidu in 2017, comma, said this and according to Naidu. So this is at the beginning of a sentence. So here you start with the author, date in brackets. In this case, you say according to, and then you present the author. One day you'll find a journal article, use the prescribed. I've mentioned that earlier, that you use the author guidelines of a journal. For a PhD study, if you registered in 2020, I think, up to now, you have to submit 2 articles to accredited journals before you can graduate. That must be submitted. People registered before 2020 must only submit 1 article. So just have a look at that. That's what I said, that I include, or my students must include the page numbers. If the journal don't want the page numbers, they then I then request them to just remove the page numbers. Also, some of the journals, for example, have Naidu, comma, and Nguni, but this is not a method that I find very often. It might be due to the discipline that I present and author my publications. Okay, references should be current, including some of the recent sources. I can show you, if somebody can just remind me how on Google Scholar to set the parameters so that you can get free or recent documents. So if there's still time left, I'm more than willing to show you how to do that. It's going to solve you a lot of trouble. When you cite a dated yet important source, that is like classic paper, seminal work, like my example of Maslow's hierarchy, right? Indicate the exact year and the first publication where it has been published. Keep all sources electronic or printed copies of journal articles. Now, this is a personal preference, and that's not something that I advise, but I prefer to work from hard copies because then I can use my highlighter, and per topic or per theme, I highlight it in different highlight colors. But we don't want to use a lot of trees. So I am now moving over to the electronic version straight or purely because it's too expensive to print. So it depends, and I also advise my students to save the PDF and not the online version, because if you save the PDF document, you can see the exact page numbers of an article. All right. Also, what I found that my daughter, for example, when she is busy with research, she takes photos of the different pages of textbooks and especially ebooks, and then she saves it in a folder. That is another example that if that works for you. All right. When you consult a library book or borrow a book, make copies or scan of a few pertinent pages. Now, what I include is the cover page, the next page where it says who's the author, when it was published, also the publishing house. So I make copies of that, or I take photos of that. So that can also help you, so that when you need to go back to that reference, you know exactly where to get that information from that book or article, or what the case may be. Then, different verbs. I mentioned to you that some of my students, or one of my students this week, used the word said throughout a paragraph. That was the only verb that was used. Now we divide it into descriptive, analytical, and evaluative. If it's descriptive, you can use, there's a variety of ones. If it's a definition, you use defines. If they argue something and they provide, you can say comments. If they consulted the authors, a number of references, you can say comments. If they make a statement, you can say claims, describes. Alternate these words and the verbs, make sure that it fits the context of the sentence. This is analytical. For example, you have a definition or multiple definitions. You analyze them and you come up with your own definition for your study. This is important on a PhD level, is that you must be able to argue and justify why you are making use of a specific reference or references, if it contradicts or what the case may be. Then here is analytical words, and then also evaluative. If you evaluate, for example, several definitions or several conclusions from different research studies. You can either affirms or agrees or confirm, or you concur, or you argue, or you challenge. There is various ones for you there that I've included. Then acronyms. When you use an acronym for the first time in your document, write it down in full, and from that point onwards, you only use the acronym. Remember that you must have a list of acronyms. It's normally positioned after your table of contents with your list of figures and your list of tables. You include a list of acronyms. Because remember, when we read through your work and the examiners read through your work, some students include a lot of acronyms. We get confused. So please make sure. What I also advise my students is to use it, for example, say for example in chapter 1, and then in chapter 2, just introduce it again so that the reader know exactly. I know it's duplication and it might not be necessary, but I just want to remind my readers about what it is that the acronym stands for. Okay, that's what I mentioned in the second bullet. And then I also include a list of acronyms or a list of abbreviations, where to position that as well. Then let's look at numbers. For numbers 1 to 9, you need to write it in words. For 10 and above, you make use of figures. As already stated, do not start a sentence with a number. There is 2 examples for you there, 50 participants and rather say 50 participants. What you can do is, if it's at the beginning of a sentence, you can write it in words 50, and then you can write between brackets 50. That is acceptable, and this is what my students do. And then for a percentage, you must either in the text use percent in words and between brackets a percentage sign. Some people write percent as per and cent in 2 different words. Make sure that if you use percent or 100% that you use it throughout your document. Participants and gender. Now, gender can only be included in your measuring tool if it really contributes towards the essence of your study. The general rule is to omit any reference to gender. We have different types or different gender groups. LGBTQI+, I hope I've got it right. If I offend somebody by not having all that correctly and in the correct order, I apologize for that. But because we have different gender groups, rather than don't make reference to he or she. That is a dangerous territory to go through to. Rather than say, instead of having he, him, or hers, rather than make use of they. That is a safer option. All right. And I can't overemphasize the fact that if you have to include in your study, in the demographical section, you have to include gender. You will see that when you do apply for ethical clearance, if the reviewers find that it doesn't contribute to the study, they will then comment and you have to remove it. Okay. Now, words and phrases and terms. You need never be at a loss for words again. See the list of Word documents sent to you called Informal Tips for Academic Writing. I also include that for you as well. Then make use of the online thesaurus for synonyms. Be very careful. Make sure that you use the appropriate synonyms. Don't just choose from the list one that you think sounds fancy. All right, it might not fit the content of that particular sentence. So just make sure that the synonym that you use from the thesaurus or the list of synonyms fit the content and context of what you are trying to convey. Okay, I'm not going to add this list of verbs separately because I've included it here for you. Examples of natural verbs, the author says or says, notes, declares, relates. There's different ones for you to select from. Again, it must fit the context of the sentence. Then there's stronger verbs like agrees, cautions, disputes. There it is. And then inference verbs imply, suggest, and thinks. I just want to see something else. So this is a handy guide for you to use. Then literature studies. In general, integrate sources in your literature study. This helps to avoid plagiarism. Okay, now on this point, I strongly discourage you from using any paraphrasing tools. What is a paraphrasing tool? There's different ones like Quillbot. There is a variety of them. What it does is you copy a paragraph or a sentence, you run it through the software program, and it replaces some of the words, some of the verbs, some of the adjectives, also change the word order. But remember, when you do turn it in, it still picks this up as plagiarism. I've done an experiment where I did that, and I can safely tell you that that is a route not to follow. Please, my example of writing on a piece of paper and then convert it to your document, and then also read through it, change the word order, find other synonyms and rewrite it. That avoids plagiarism big time. So please don't make yourself guilty. You can be expelled from the institution. It's a serious offense. One accepted style is to put a citation or a reference after each point of sentence. That is acceptable if you use different references. However, you have to integrate several sources relating to a specific theme to make related points. You can combine the references in brackets. Say, for example, van Antwerpen, Dube and Naidu said the same thing. So between brackets, you can say at the end of the sentence, list all those references. Okay. Avoid a series of paragraphs, each devoted to work of a particular author. Combine that in a same or in one paragraph if it deals with the same line of thought. So please remember that as well. However, if we use a model or a concept by a certain author as the basis of the research, it's fine to devote a lengthy section to that single author. So please come back to this slide to just guide you there as well. I'm continuing with the literature studies. It's important in a literature review to refer not only to definitions. We don't want a literature chapter with definitions, a lot of definitions. Again, that example of mine that my students must use to include a table, you can include a table with different definitions. That is really very handy, and you can see with one glance where the definitions are the same, where it is different, and you can motivate and justify what helped there as well. Also, similar study that can help you to identify the gap in the study and in the scholarly domain, and to motivate why you need to do an investigation or a study on that particular topic. Right. It's not usual in literature study to give our own opinions. You refer to the literature. Own opinions can come in when you analyze your data and you provide feedback, especially if you have field experience. But if you need to do so, have a subheader, application to the present study. Sometimes people are working in industry and there's things that they find, and that can be an application to the study, is to add your own voice. It's very important when you construct, customize or adapt a model, a framework, set of criteria or set of principles to use in your own work, especially on PhD level, is to come up with your own conceptual model or framework. We refer to that as a conceptual framework. It's only a model if you have tested it. So that will only then be a follow-up study, is to set that by testing it. Then it becomes a model. Still on this section, a section called discussion can address various approaches. That is something to take note of. In certain literature study or research studies, provide a form of data. In that case, the information from the literature is called secondary data. If you do your study and you collect data through interviews or questionnaires, we refer to that as primary data because you did it, it wasn't collected earlier. But if you make use of referencing that and use that again, we refer to that as secondary data. Okay? Then you might consolidate a section with a table of points that be underlying principles and criteria. Again, that is the table that I referred to several times. Motivate each point, give it its literature reference, cross-reference to a section in your own work, like for example, previous studies, year, the authors, and the findings. I've explained to you this particular table. It can be the start of your own synthesis framework or a model. Right, when you start your empirical work, repeat the table with a column on practical implications for your own research. That is also referred to as a golden thread. Now, before I continue, what is a golden thread? From your title or your topic of your study to the last word, there must be a golden thread. It mustn't be individual sections that's got almost nothing to do. If we look at a puzzle, okay, you start off with different puzzle pieces. You join that to get and to complete the puzzle, to get the entire picture, okay? Now, your study the same. At the end, you must see a completed puzzle picture, the entire picture. It's not individual sections. All of them contribute towards the golden thread of your final manuscript. So that is very important. That's why I say you link one chapter. You say, for example, after chapter 2. In this chapter, I discussed, for example, soil, agricultural things and all of those. And then in the next chapter, I will deal with X, Y, and Z. That is a way of attending to the golden thread. Then submitting a section of proposal to your supervisor. I don't know if you experienced the following scenario. That sense of relief when your draft is done. You have 3 drafts according to the institutional prescriptions, right? Then you can't wait to hit the send button and to catch up on your private life. Now that is then the supervisor's problem, who must review your document. Then you decide what is on TV, where is the baby, no one can catch up at office, or there's no food at the house. There's different things that you need to catch up on. But it's very difficult for a supervisor to review a document full of slips and errors. It distracts us from focusing on the content. Supervisors should concentrate on the academic content and the holistic picture. It is not our task to do language correction, consistency checking, and technical editing. It's not our job. My advice to you is, you know that you are busy or you are enrolled for a master's study or a doctoral study. You must have a language editor. You must budget for that if you don't have a bursary, but on the proposal module, you are not entitled to be a grant or a bursary holder. That's only when your proposal phase or module has been accepted. Always budget for a language editor and a technical editor. And I can tell you safely that those are major expenses. So make sure that you get quotations while you are busy with your proposal module, because when you submit your final document, it must also be language edited. All right, so just make sure that that's not a surprise to you. You need to reread and check your drafts meticulously before you send it to your supervisor. It is important, candidates and colleagues, that your students write, rewrite, read, reread to make sure that there's no plagiarism, that there's a golden thread, that all the important topics has been covered. Now, this is where the mind map comes in handy. That makes or lead to the fact that you stay within the parameters of your study, that you don't wander off. And also there is different programs, free programs, where you can do your own mind maps. That is very nice. I had some of them in previous presentations, but I removed it, otherwise it becomes too lengthy. So just check it out. Ask your supervisor to assist you with a mind map, but that's actually your own job. Present your supervisor with a mind map so that he and she can provide input on that as well. We are just continuing here. If supervisors identify too many obvious mistakes, repetition, duplication, technical errors, they might return it for corrections. Now, I can safely tell you that if a student submits to me something for revision, if I get the 5th spelling mistake, I immediately stop revising the document. I send it back to the student to fix it, because that shows and proves to me that my students do not have respect for me at all. I hope you understand it. It might sound very harsh, but it's not our duty. Some of us are supervising more than 10 students. Think for yourself if we have to address all of those technical errors and language errors. We don't get time to revise and review your content. So my students have the opportunity or the privilege to make 5 spelling mistakes, then I send it back. However, if a draft, okay, this is what I send to you. I send it back, and also what I do is I take the previous version with my comments, and then I see if they attended to the comments. What is also good practice, and that is also what my students need to do, if they make changes, to highlight it so that the supervisor can see immediately that there is changes as highlighted by the comments and suggestions. That means that the supervisor don't have to read through all of the document or the entire document from scratch. It really helps us to make sure that we provide the best service to our students who are our clients. I indicated also that language editing is very important, but an expensive exercise. It's normally conducted before the manuscript is examined, so please budget for that. When you apply for a bursary or a grant, make sure that you get quotations that are enough and adequate so that you are able to make use of your language editor that you didn't budget inappropriately. Okay, language editing. It must be language edited by an accredited language editor, because they need to submit proof of evidence that it was done. They must ideally be registered by the Guild of Language Editors. That is a body. The language editors must adhere to certain standards and have the correct qualification. Before you submit for your colloquium, either by peer review or by expert or of the presentation. Tips for checking. Reread a document a few days after completing it, not immediately. Give yourself 2 or 3 days, read with a fresh mind. Eliminate obvious errors, check your language and technical. Look at the numbering of your tables and figures. Look at the structure. Is there a logical flow? Do you have a lead sentence? The paragraph that sets out what it's supposed to do. Are there contradictions or inconsistencies? Pretend as if you are somebody reading it for the first time. Put a supervisor's hat on and see if you can see it through the lens or the eyes of the supervisor. That really helps us as supervisors a great deal. I'm continuing from the previous slide. Would some content fit better in a next section? Then try to incorporate it there. You must discover that yourself and determine whether that is the case or not. Are there similar issues addressed in different subsections? If so, combine them. Are there links and relationships between your different sections, and is it clear? Has the terminology been used for the same concepts consistently throughout your documents? Did you use the sources and when you wrote your section, your literature sources? Still tips for checking how is the sequence. Then important, can you improve on the sequence of your manuscript? Is there a strong build-up for every concept? Again, make sure that it's not individual puzzle pieces, that at the end of the day, there's a golden thread that you might be able or should be able to complete your puzzle. If you are making a point or an argument, is there a lead sentence? before you make your argument. Remember I said you start a paragraph with a lead sentence, a punchline, and then you present the argument and then either support it or is there any contradiction. Then when you reread it, do you find a sentence that sets out things very well, should appear clearly in a section? If so, make your punch up front. What I say is that in an article, we start with a punchline to catch the reader's attention. In paragraphs, in sections, have a lead sentence with a punchline. Ask yourself about the logic structure. I've mentioned this. Can it be improved? Should you change the order of the phrases in your sentences? Be objective. This can help you, especially when you are busy with your dissertation or thesis. Not so much in the proposal, but it's also applicable to your proposal. What is scientific writing? It's academic writing. Remember, you are not writing a WhatsApp message to somebody or an informal email. Scientific writing should be factful and the research as well. Findings from your collection should be reported objectively. Again, the sweeping statements. It should not contain any generalizations. That is part of the sweeping statements. Any inaccurate statements, make sure that it's the truth and the honest truth. Allegations or sweeping statements. With sweeping statements, for example, the extraordinary explosion of the use of the World Wide Web has led to. So just make use or just look at that example. Google sweeping statements and see for yourself different examples if you are not familiar with this concept. Avoid any exaggerated remarks. For example, results from the project should be used to revolutionize, and then the rest of the sentence. Revolutionize is not important. It does not add any value to your sentence. No slang, no vulgar or popular use of language is allowed. Remember, scientific and academic writing. Okay, this is something that I read myself from time to time. I write as I walk because I want to get somewhere. The same with your writing. You write because you want to finish your research study, your proposal, your manuscript. And I write as straight as I can. Remember I said don't include all the gimmicks and fancy words. Get from Pretoria to Johannesburg in the shortest possible way, because that is the shortest way of getting there. I find this very valuable. Okay, keep your sentences and your paragraphs short and concise. It shows that the academic focus and clear academic thinking is intact. It is easy to write long essays. It is difficult to write it in a short way, but that is a skill. That's why I'm saying write on a piece of paper a paragraph, convert it to your Word document, read it, reread it. Make sure that you include all the references. At postgraduate level, it is expected of you to formulate viewpoints academically and scientifically. This refers to, or it differs completely the opposite from writing an essay. Writing essays should serve as a good practice for academic writing. That is a stepping stone. But remember that there is a difference. Long research or business report is not an indication of academic excellence. I have one student who is employed in a very high position in one of the government departments. The student is constantly busy with report writing, and it's challenging to get him to put a different hat on, not to be the report writer in his position, but to be the scholar. And it's really challenging for us as supervisors, and also challenging for the student. A well-structured academic and well-formulated one is: never try to pad your research script or scientific article with extra information just to get the required length. I had a student yesterday who sent me a WhatsApp and said, "Prof, how long must my document, my final document be?" That's very difficult. With a proposal, there's sometimes requirements. I know in the department that I am part of, the requirements for a proposal is between 30 to 40 pages, not more than 40 pages. But again, it depends on the discipline. It also depends on the requirements of your department. Make sure. But as soon as my students ask me, how long should it be? I know that, oops, they are going to now look for additional information to put it in there. And then I'm very skeptical that the golden thread might not be there. Okay, you'll be shooting yourself in the foot because you receive lower marks. Unfortunately, that is the truth. We want the essence, we want the skeleton, we want to know with just enough flesh what it is that you are going to do. Then the right length relates to the integration of sources, that's articles, scholarly, books, and all the rest. And that shows to us, as the supervisors and examiners, that you as a student are able to master the studied literature. Now, if we look at integration, integrate theory with theory and theory with research results meaningfully. So you look at theory. Remember, there must be theory that forms the foundation of your project. And you need to look at theory in relation to research results. Theoretical knowledge, referred to as secondary knowledge, should be integrated before you present your primary knowledge, because at the end of the day, you are going to link the findings from your primary data to the literature. That means you either support what has been found previously, or your data contradicts what other scholars found. In this process, through the body of knowledge is built within the specific scientific field or subfield. Now, what is the body of knowledge? That is in the scholarly and academic domain that you'll find contributions to the body of knowledge. You need to add value, and especially on a PhD level, you need to close a gap. You identified a gap that hasn't been researched before, and you must be able to close the gap in the final conclusion of your study. At master's level, you need to prove that you are equipped and able to do a research methodology chapter, as well as data collection, and that you are able to interpret the results. So that is the difference between the two. Okay, the researcher must first contextualize their current research by giving the theoretical background in which the current research falls. That's why I say have your table with all the information, the findings from previous studies. The essence form part of academic writing style, and you must be able to identify the gap from previous studies. Where you find the gap is where they say in an article, recommendations for future research. I always go to that and see what they propose there, because they identified a gap in their study, and that will also give you guidance as well. The viewpoints of different authors on specific subjects, secondary knowledge, remember it comes from literature, must be integrated in your document or in your manuscript. It must be assessed. You need to analyze it, synthesize, and then compile. This is extremely important on PhD level. It should not be a mere compilation of information and definitely not horizontal compilation without any depth. Remember, it must be vertical. With that, we mean you add like building blocks, different things on top of each other. So you must add to the body of knowledge. You can only do that if your review and the information is building blocks on top of each other. Horizontal means that you simply provide information that is secondary of nature. Various literature sources, research ideas and perceptions of the author should be integrated meaningfully and presented logically. Also, remember the word justification and justify. We need evidence. Right. Then additional integration guidelines. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. It's not necessary to describe a phenomenon from square one. That means from the initial words. You build on a building block and foundation. You don't present it at the beginning. You build up with your literature and then present the phenomenon. Just mention what is necessary to explain the essence or the crux thereof. And then important, the emphasis should be placed on what is necessary to meet your objectives, your research questions, hypotheses, whatever the case may be. Some studies, the supervisor wants the aim and the aims and objectives, the primary and secondary objectives, or they request you to include research questions as well. Primary questions and secondary questions. Please follow the prescriptions and the guidelines of your supervisor. Then when a topic is discussed in the study, then different viewpoints from different sources must be compared. Remember I said to you about the example of person A said this, person B said that, person C said that, and you are compiling from that your own definition or your own viewpoint and motivate why. They must be evaluated and integrated. Do they differ from one another? Justify. Is it contradictory? Also indicate that as well. I again include here that the table is very helpful. Example, two authors identify 5 concepts of a phenomenon, but a third author adds 2 more components. Use this as a discussion or an argument to form your own point of view. Then I've just indicated this is an example for you. Van Antwerpen in 2017 said this, Bruins 2018 said that, and then Dube in 2020 at another field. Right. That is an example. In other words, indicate the importance of Dube's information for your present study. So remember, you need to add to the body of knowledge. So who will be the body of knowledge in this case? The biggest contribution will be Dube. If two authors differ from each other, use this point of discussion and form your own viewpoint. I just indicate that to you on the previous 2 slides. I'm not going to repeat it again. Okay, there is quite a lot going on here. Compare the viewpoints. There is an example for you again. It's just another example. You remember the verbs that I gave you in a list, right? In contrast, can you see that this is a secondary type of verb? It's a stronger verb than said or mentioned, right? Or agrees or disagree. To this, Black points out that the scope of spontaneity could be allowed. Then write something such as the following. There is an example for you. It should be kept in mind that spontaneity under controlled experimental circumstances is not predictable and therefore cannot be manipulated. Especially the second element, namely inability to control the experiment, could have negative implications for the researcher and therefore not considered an option. Can you see that you argued all the information that you presented here? You argued and you provide a motivation, a justification for what your study will apply. Formulating this way, the information that has been studied applied to the present study. The information has been assessed, synthesized, or compiled and integrated into the research report. Here is just other examples for you. Consulted a number of authors. You can go through this on your own. It just builds up on what I explained to you. There is purely examples. All right. It will not suffice at master and doctoral level to merely compile sources. Students are required to know insight into the subject, because remember, you are the subject experts. We are there to guide you and to ensure that you are on the right track. But you as the student remains the subject experts. Then a systematic presentation by means of meaningful headings. It is important that when you introduce a new topic, that you provide an introduction and that you systematically provide the subsections, right, before you introduce another sections. Then I mentioned about the headings. It's not only names for sections. Make sure that it's precise. It also makes sure that you follow the golden thread throughout each section, and it must also form one entire puzzle at the end of the day. With the headings, it indicates to us that you understand what you are doing and also proceed and present the theory and empirical part after taking the aims, objectives into account. Additional guidance, continuing from the previous screen, it must be structured according to the theme, your aims, your goals, your research questions, the objectives, hypothesis or research questions. Goals are broad, long-term and overall targets, whereas objectives are more specific, short-term, and it should be measurable as well as achievable. Remember, in your last chapter, you are going to include again your objectives or your research questions and then see whether your study met that or whether there is still a gap. Everything must form an entire holistic document. The title of your study consists of certain concepts and constructs that forms the building blocks. They appear on the which have appearing on the research question or problem. So that must form part and must be incorporated there as well. It very often happens that when you completed your study, after getting your findings, you find that your topic or your title might change slightly. So don't be surprised if that is the case. I remember with my PhD, my topic changed. So that is not a big deal. You just apply for that so that your ethical clearance being updated with your new topic. It's not, you just ask for an amendment. And for your intention to submit, there's also an option there to say whether the title changed. Also, what happens is after examination, the examiners might suggest a change of your title. So in conceptualization of your study within particular theoretical frameworks of the research, the major concepts, constructs and subconstructs should be explained. Normally a subsection is dedicated to each of these constructs. Now you start off with your title, it boils down to constructs and concepts. Then you have your major constructs or subconstructs that need to be explained, and then the subsection is dedicated to each of those. Then, Be comprehensive and don't use recent and applicable information. And use, sorry, not don't use, use. To be comprehensive is to discuss and justify the most important facts, theories and models appropriate to your subject matter. Remember, you must read widely, né? It's not just copy and pasting from other articles. The most important and most recent trends in literature should have been consulted. If there's time left and if there is a need, I will show you quickly on Google Scholar how to get the most recent articles if there is a need. Then your conclusion is to prove that you have insight in your study. Conclusions arrive from your research. This opportunity to show that you are academically capable to present your document. It must have logical conclusions. Also formulate them in words based on your actual findings. Do not add new theoretical information in the conclusion. No sources. In other words, refer back to theory. Be accurate. You as a researcher who are the student at this stage should be a scientist. You must put your scientific hat on in the true sense of a word. Academics should be meticulous, academic writing and research. Apply the principle throughout your research study and your manuscript. Then 10 tips to improve academic writing. Write to the level of the intended audience. Now, who's your audience? It is other scholars in your field. It is colleagues. It might be, or it's definitely the reviewers and examiners and your supervisor. You must build on the past because remember, you must contribute towards the body of knowledge. Get to the point, take a stand. Provide supporting evidence. That is where the table comes in handy again. Inform the audience. Avoid literature cliches. Show a little style. You need to keep on editing. Edit, edit, and edit. Proofread leads to perfect results. Now, Grammarly. That is a program that you need to subscribe to. There is a free version, but it allows you limited options. I yearly subscribe to Grammarly for the simple reason that English is not my first language. There is an option where you can check your document for scientific writing, for formal styles, all of that. So it assist you to point out where you need to change. I can't function without Grammarly. I use that for my emails. I use that for all my documents, for my students, for teaching and learning, and for my own articles and when I compile chapters for books as well. In conclusion, in a world where people are constantly writing on informal platforms, such as blogs and social media, and Twitter, for example, it is entirely normal for young academics to feel hesitant as to whether they are striking a proper tone in their formal writing. Ultimately, it is only through experimentation and practice that you will find the form that best suits your work. There is references that I consulted. I've included there for you YouTube videos. Please, YouTube will be your best friend and make it your best friend. Sometimes there is a bit of nonsense that I would not advise you to use. The ones that I've included here, I've worked through that and I looked at it and I made sure that it will contribute towards your growth, and this is really valuable. There is the academic thread. Remember, it must go throughout your document, from the beginning, the first word to the last word, from proposal, from the beginning to the end, as well as in your dissertation and thesis as well. Now I'm going to read this to you because this is really valuable for me. It's none of their business that you have to learn how to write. Every writer I know has trouble writing. The scariest moment is always just before you start. Never, never, never give up. A writer is a person for whom writing is more difficult than it is for other people. I can vouch for that. I struggle sometimes to write. It sometimes feels to me as if I hit a brick wall and I don't know what to do. If you get writer's block, close your work, leave it for a day or two, and then you try again. This is sometimes that I struggle, and this is my way of mitigating writer's block. So I hope that this contributes towards your knowledge and will make your life easier. As I said, you can refer back to this as many times as you want to. I made this presentation practical and it is here for you to use.